in today's conflict. And as you know, we have a conversation that we have with all parties to a conflict, and we try to implement activities, humanitarian activities that are aimed at providing protection and assistance to civilian population against the consequences of the conflict. It's therefore important to mention that some of the activities that we carry out, indeed, as we are now in the topic of silencing the guns and peace building, some of those activities may be considered, and especially if they are provided for in an impartial, neutral way, as having a value in building trust and confidence building among communities, and as they assure, of course, a restoration of basic human rights and dignity of affected population. But allow me to really focus on three things that are at the heart of the African Union. It's silencing the guns roadmap, but also which resonate with the Commission's agenda as regards the respect of IHL and human rights. In this respect, when it comes to conflict, the decisions relating to the war, the way that the war is fought, plays a role in determining the scale of destruction and the suffering that the countries and affected populations will need to recover from. This is an important remark, in a sense that if you look at an individual level or at a household level, any death or injury that is caused by conflict has obviously a physical impact on the family or on the person, psychological, social, and financial impact. So violations of IHL fuels a continuous spiral of violence, such as violence against women, displacement, migration, missing persons, and broader erosion of basic human rights. And I think, as Commissioner, as the chairperson spoke much earlier, when a war breaks out, when a conflict breaks out, it's not a child's play. It is basically already a situation whereby there is a mobilization of the military and security forces with weaponry and a means of warfare that is likely to have an impact on the social services, on the people in terms of their displacement and their security, and therefore that's why I said that the decisions that the parties make in terms of the manner in which they are going to wage the war has an impact on the eventual consequences. When it comes to public services, and I mentioned that earlier, in terms of infrastructure, if there is an attack on a school, if there is an attack on a electricity system, or if there is an attack on a water system, that obviously has an immediate effect on the functioning of the health facilities, on the wastewater management, on public health, on schools, and therefore undermining already even the development gains that the country had already achieved. For that matter, IHL contains important rules and obligations which, if they are respected by fighters, can help to reduce the long-term impact of the war on the critical infrastructure and on the integrity of the essential systems on the people's means of survival. So when military and political actors respect and ensure respect for these rules, they are not only complying with their obligation, they are also safeguarding the development and reducing or even preventing humanitarian needs and minimizing development reversals. The second point that I wish to make is really to look on the issue of arms and weapons availability and transfers, especially small arms. We cannot ignore the impact of the supply and use of weapons. Widespread and poorly controlled availability of arms due to irresponsible transfers to irresponsible actors are a major cause of suffering. The circulation of arms into any country is obviously inextricably linked to the potential concerns and issues around their utilization, the rule of law, the use of force, risks of breaches for human rights, and overall peace and security environment. Therefore, respect of the regional and sub-regional instruments regulating arms, such as the small arms protocols, the ATT, have a correlation to the overall respect of human rights in the continent. If we are to achieve, as the chairperson was speaking earlier, the aspiration of Agenda 2063, the silencing the guns and bequeathing the future generations of a conflict-free continent. Finally, I wish to talk about prevention, and prevention is really one of the pillars that is mentioned in the Commission's report when it comes to situations of armed conflict, and the value of strengthening conflict prevention and early warning. The ICRC engages very strongly in the training and strengthening capacities of the armed forces, police and security agents on respect of international humanitarian law and human rights, with an ultimate aim of creating an environment conducive to compliance with the basic rules of IHL and human rights law as they apply to armed conflict and law enforcement. So yesterday we had a workshop together with the African Union that brought together a number of member states and AU missions, AMISOM, MNTGF, and others. What were we looking at? We were looking at how to develop guidelines that would help the member states in strengthening their capacities for carrying out investigations of violations of IHL and human rights in the peace support missions that they deploy. So that is an important element of working with the member states when it comes to them deploying peace support operations, that they have preparations, adequate preparations of the teams and the troops that when they go into mission, that if there are violations of international humanitarian law and human rights law, they are able to investigate them and take remedial action. So that is an example of a collaboration with the African Union in strengthening their compliance frameworks, especially when it comes to peace support operations. I'm glad to report that, of course, when the AU representative spoke yesterday, one of the points that he underlined is that the AU wants to have a clear message of zero tolerance when it comes to violations of international humanitarian law and human rights when it comes to their peace support operations. And we have been working very closely also with the AU in building the different guidelines and rules of engagement to support the African Union when it comes to peace support operations. So that is important, that when it comes to preparations of peacekeepers, that these mechanisms are already put in place to reduce any violations of IHL. When it comes to member states, of course, it's important that they strengthen their commitment and capacity to respect and ensure respect for IHL and human rights, bearing in mind that the ripple effect of the destabilization brought by armed conflict and violence could lead to mass displacement and total system failures due to conflict and destruction at times, wiping out decades of development and infrastructure achievements. So in conclusion, I want just to say that, of course, peace processes and conflict resolution are political processes, and humanitarian response cannot be a solution to political problems. At the heart of all these requires really that all efforts are put in addressing the root causes of and underlying the conflicts that we see in the continent, and providing political solutions so that we reduce the necessity to mobilize humanitarian assistance. But I cannot overemphasize the point of early warning and prevention, strengthening the compliance mechanisms within the security forces, both police, but also when it comes to the armed forces, in order that when they go to war, we have a reduction in the impact of the conflict. As a matter of fact, just to say that the level and scale of humanitarian consequences that we see today is attributable to the level of respect of international humanitarian law and human rights. So that is important, and I think that is really also where I see a strong role played by the African Commission on Human People's Rights, because together with the national human rights institutions, because it's important that we continue to strengthen the capacities within the countries when it comes to rule of law, but also respecting the obligations related to respect to international law and human rights law. So those are the few remarks that I wanted to make, as it is a panel, and we'll be glad to hear the feedback from the commissioners. But I really want to appreciate the collaboration that is existing between us and the commission, and also it's good that Ambassador Tesfaye is also there representing the Peace and Security Council, because we also work closely with the Peace and Security Council, so in highlighting humanitarian concerns that we see in the continent. And I think it's important that these institutions are strengthened. I thank you, Chairperson, for the opportunity.
Thank you very much, Bruce, for those very insightful and pertinent observations, as well as highlights. I think the interventions that you have made clearly underscore the interdependence of the work of the ICRC, and indeed the complementarity of that work with the work of the African Commission on Human and People's Rights. The point that you have made, of course, we can't emphasize enough, that ultimately humanitarian responses do not fix a situation that can only be resolved and permanently solved through a political process. So the imperative of the primacy of politics and the political process is indeed a very important point, which we at the African Commission could only echo, as that is the avenue through which the conditions for peace, but also for the enjoyment of human and people's rights can be established. Thank you once again. I will just draw in my intervention the attention of colleagues, participants, representatives of states, NHRIs, and civil society organizations to a very important work of the African Commission on Human and People's Rights. And this relates to Resolution 332, which is a resolution on the Commission's focus on human rights in conflict or crisis situations. A resolution on the basis of which the Commission adopted a landmark study, which has become the foundation for the Commission's engagement and proactive response to human rights issues that arise in conflict or crisis situations. This is the study of the Commission, which is basically titled Addressing Human Rights Issues in Conflict Situations, adopted by the Commission on the basis of Resolution 332 last year. This highlights of this has been presented to the Peace and Security Council during the consultative meeting that we held with the PSC at its 953rd meeting held on 8 October 2020, which the PSC has welcomed. And in this respect, of course, I wish to draw the attention of all of you that we have also had an opportunity to also present this study and indeed its conclusions to the annual joint meeting of National Human Rights Commissions under the umbrella of NANRI and the African Union Commission through the Department of Political Affairs, which underscores the critical role that Ambassador Tesfaye, as well as Bruce highlighted, of human rights and indeed human rights actors for ensuring that human and people's rights standards of IHL are complied with and respected. And the compliance with and respect of these standards indeed on its own can constitute other basis for prevention of conflicts. It can constitute also, as when conflicts erupt, as creating the conditions for a speedy resolution of those conflicts. When these standards are not complied with in crisis or conflict situations, the possibilities for the resolution of the conflict becomes protracted because these violations of human rights and IHL exacerbate the polarization, the sense of bitterness, not only among the conflicting parties, but also importantly, the wider public, which is directly affected by the devastations that war, however justified, if at all there is any justification for war, brings about on the life, physical security, well-being of individuals, communities, and societies in general. So the study have identified five pillars, some of which have been mentioned in the interventions by both Bruce and Ambassador Tesfaye. But I wish, for the benefit of all of us, to highlight these five pillars, which the PSC in its communique also underscored, the importance of which the PSC underscored in its communique of the 853rd, its 854th meeting. The first of these is what we call the monitoring and response pillar. And this, of course, relates to the butter and bread issue of the work of the Commission. You have to constantly monitor human rights developments in states parties to the African Charter and initiate pertinent responses, which ensure actually that the standards of the African Charter and IHL standards are complied with, whether in crisis situation or conflict situation. And indeed, for before crisis or conflict situations arise as well. The second pillar is the prevention pillar. And the prevention pillar, of course, relates to what happens once conflict or crisis has erupted. And the prevention pillar, in this sense, therefore, puts emphasis on the imperative that violations and conflict are, violations in situations of conflict are completely avoided. And this is so central to reduce not only the suffering of civilians and the distractions that Bruce made reference to earlier on, but also importantly, for purpose of responsibility of conflict parties. Because breaching these standards of human rights and IHL obviously leads to accountability of those who engage in the perpetration of those violations, disregarding the demands for the protection of civilians from the consequences of violence and war and conflict, and indeed from deliberate targeting of civilians and civilian objects. The third pillar is what we call mainstreaming of human rights into conflict prevention, management, resolution, and post-conflict reconstruction and development processes of regional and international actors. This is also very critical. As Bruce mentioned, the Commission, on the request of the Peace Support Operations Division of the African Union Commission in 2018, engaged in also doing an assessment and supplying a comprehensive report highlighting the kinds of standards, legal materials that the African human rights system avails in order to ensure that peace support operations of the African Union comply with the human rights standards. And one of the factors for the study indeed is the recognition that the African Union has come to assume increasing role and responsibilities And by assuming these increasing roles and responsibilities in peace processes, the need for the African Union to comply with and to ensure compliance with these standards have become important. So mainstreaming human rights in the full peace and security cycle of the African Union and regional economic communities is very important. The fourth pillar is remedial action. It is an unfortunate fact of life and fact of war, conflict, and crisis that violations may not totally be avoided. And when violations do happen, it is imperative that those violations are thoroughly, independently, and transparently investigated. And indeed, importantly, remedial actions and measures are taken to ensure that those who suffered the violations are provided with redress and justice. And those who perpetrated the violations are held accountable. The last and the fifth pillar is the institutional coordination and synergy with institutions responsible for the maintenance of peace and security. The point that Ambassador Tasfaye made earlier on. This collaboration is key and important. So colleagues, members of the Commission, excellencies, representatives of states, as we reflect on the African Union agenda of silencing the guns, I'm sure all of you do recognize and know that ensuring respect for human and people's rights is a prerequisite and indeed a sine qua non for the achievement of silencing the guns. That is why, in the course of this year, we at the African Commission on Human and People's Rights have initiated a discussion, a deliberation, and made various submissions to the African Union system, including in our annual consultation with the Peace and Security Council, underscoring the point that human and people's rights for silencing the guns in Africa, that without these, the guns can't be silenced. And indeed, violations of these rights lead to, and often underlay the eruption of conflicts. And we at the African Commission, in the light of the explicit mandate bestowed on us under the African Charter to promote the right to peace and security under Article 23 of the African Charter, we can't emphasize enough to say that peace is the only way, and the importance of political solutions can't be overemphasized. So as we push for what appears to be today, as we speak, a very distant dream, a dream which we should do everything to realize, for silencing the guns. It is incumbent on us to play our respective roles at the African Commission on Human and People's Rights, at the ICRC, at the PSC, as individual citizens of our continent, so that people are spared from the consequences of war, from the devastations it causes, from the death and maim that it leads to, from the displacement that it causes. We do hope that through this deliberation, we will be able to provide some insights and inputs into the extraordinary summit expected to take place at the end of this year. I therefore wish to thank you all for your kind attention and wish to open the floor for inputs and contributions, observations, and questions. If colleagues, members of the Commission wish to take the floor, honorable commissioners, please kindly let me know if you can show your hand. That would be great. Okay, Vice Chairperson, you have the floor, please.
Ouais. Merci beaucoup pour la parole que vous m'accordez là. Je pense que nous sommes déjà en dehors des limites du temps pour pouvoir intervenir adéquatement. Ainsi donc, je vais résumer mes propos pour éviter des débordements. Je voudrais d'abord féliciter tous les panélistes qui se sont suivis cet après-midi autour de ce thème de l'année, Silencing the Gun, faire taire les armes. Pour rappel, si en 1945, les droits de l'homme sont nés au niveau des Nations Unies, c'est parce que les armes parlaient. Si les droits de l'homme sont nés en 1945 aux Nations Unies, c'est parce que les droits de l'homme avaient parlé de 40 en 45 au cours de la Seconde Guerre mondiale. C'est lorsqu'il a fallu que les forces alliées ou coalisées se mettent ensemble pour faire taire ces armes que les droits de l'homme étaient nés. Il est tout à fait normal aujourd'hui en Afrique qu'on utilise ce thème pour 2020 en indiquant qu'en faisant taire les armes, on donne quand même l'espoir aux droits de l'homme de pouvoir émerger, de pouvoir s'épanouir en Afrique. Mais la question que je voudrais poser aux panélistes, mais alors à tous, surtout qu'on a la chance d'avoir son Excellence Monsieur l'ambassadeur qui préside le Conseil de paix et de sécurité pour cet exercice avec nous, je voudrais vraiment, sans langue de bois, qu'il puisse nous expliquer un tout petit peu, parce qu'on est en train de faire un lien entre ce thème de l'Union africaine et le travail que nous faisons en tant qu'organe principal chargé de la promotion et de la protection des droits de l'homme, qu'il puisse un peu nous faire le bilan de cette thématique, parce que nous tendons vers la fin de l'année. Quelles sont les actions concrètes qui ont été menées pour faire taire les armes en Afrique? Quel en est le résultat? Concrètement, je voudrais savoir sur les 55 pays d'Afrique, quel est le pays qui a formellement accepté de faire taire les armes? Quel est le pays qui a formellement accepté de faire taire les armes? Parce que pour moi, faire taire les armes, il ne suffit pas seulement d'être en guerre, mais il faut aussi refuser de les acheter. Nous savons que derrière les armes, c'est tout un commerce juteux de centaines de millions de dollars qui existent. Les faire taire, pour moi, ce n'est pas seulement les utiliser en activant la gâchette, mais c'est aussi ne pas les acheter ou ne pas solliciter. Je le dis d'autant plus que chaque fois que les chefs d'État occidentaux ou bien de l'Asie sont en commerce, en relation avec le chef d'État d'Afrique, on a toujours, en marge des rencontres, des contrats qui ont été signés. Il y a toujours un contrat de vente d'armes qui existe dans ce genre de contrat. Ça ne manque jamais. C'est pour ça que je voudrais que le président du Conseil de paix et de sécurité puisse un peu nous faire le bilan. Deuxième question, Monsieur le Président, avec votre autorisation, je vais être assez rapide. Les droits de l'homme sont violés aussi bien en temps de paix, normal, ils sont violés, qu'en temps de guerre. Alors, la question que je voudrais poser, comment l'Afrique pourrait faire taire les armes quand ce sont eux-mêmes, les dirigeants africains, qui accordent ces contrats-là, comme je l'ai dit tout à l'heure, qui accordent ces contrats à ceux qui viennent chez nous pour pouvoir les solliciter, en tout cas pour les gagner. Et ils les exposent fièrement. Ces contrats ne sont même pas cachés, ce sont des contrats publics. Alors, la principale question, en tout cas, le bilan en 2020, quel est le pays, et c'est ça la dernière phrase, je la reformule pour résumer, qu'ils nous disent un peu quel est le pays, voilà, quel est le pays qui a réduit aujourd'hui sensiblement le budget de l'armée. Faire taire les armes, c'est aussi réduire le budget de l'armée. Chaque fois qu'on critique les budgets d'Afrique, c'est qu'on voit par exemple que les budgets sur les droits socio-économiques et culturels, c'est des budgets assez ridicules, alors que le budget de l'armée, il est toujours beaucoup plus grand. Quel est le pays qui a donné un exemple en 2020? On tend vers la fin de l'année, les budgets sont en train d'être consommés, nous arrivons vers la fin de l'exercice budgétaire. Quel est le bilan? Quel est le pays qui avait diminué son budget au début de l'année? Ce thème, on l'avait voté en février, si pas en janvier, le sommet qu'il y a eu en février à Addis Abeba, le sommet des chefs d'État. Quel est le pays qui a réduit sensiblement son budget 2020 au profit des autres secteurs de la vie nationale pour qu'on dise effectivement qu'on a fait taire les armes en Afrique. Donc, deux volets. Est-ce que les budgets ont été réduits parmi les 55 pays d'Afrique? Deux, ceux qui sont à la base de ces contrats, pourquoi ils le font, tout en sachant que faire taire les armes, ce n'est pas uniquement les utiliser, mais c'est aussi les acheter, en tout cas les solliciter. Voilà, Monsieur le Président, ma petite contribution pour ce panel très important, très important. Et j'espère que je pourrai obtenir quelques éléments de réponse de la part de nos panélistes. Merci pour la patience témoignée afin d'écouter cette question que je pose.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Vice Chair. Very pertinent questions in terms of how much the ideal of silencing the guns is actually brought down to the national level, which member state accepted indeed this agenda of silencing the guns, submitted to its requirements. What are we doing about arms deal? And indeed, the purchase of arms, and which country indeed reduced its budget for defense and moved or shifted that budget to defense to other priority areas for fulfilling other basic needs of society. And indeed, it is only when such concrete actions are taken that the possibility for silencing the guns can be realized. Thank you so much, Vice Chair. Any other member of the Commission? Okay, I see Commissioner Amsbury. You have the floor, please.
Thank you, Chair. It is only a comment, a continuation maybe of what the Vice President has said. And it is this: Africa does not manufacture firearms. It does not manufacture guns. It does not manufacture weapons of mass destruction. Our people are dying from starvation and ill health. Our leaders do not have money to buy food and medicine for our people. Who are these arms dealers? Who is benefiting from selling arms, selling death to Africa? Who are those nations? Why do we deal with them? Instead of selling us guns, sell us grains. Instead of selling us weapons of mass destruction, give us medicine. That should be the message that we take across if we want to silence the gun. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you so much, Commissioner Amsbury, for echoing and re-emphasizing that point that a continent that doesn't have the resources to provide for basic needs of our societies, our people, the mass of our people, food, health, water, is able to spend billions of dollars buying weapons. And what kind of priority is that? And who is benefiting in the end from that kind of missed priorities? And that we should be able to ask these questions. These are at the heart of the quest or the ideal for silencing the guns. Thank you so much, Commissioner. I don't see any other hand from colleagues, members of the Commission. On the chat box, let me read one question that has been posed, and this is about the importance of human rights, particularly in relation to silencing the guns that are being fired across the continent outside situations of conflict. All right. So when we talk about silencing the guns, the point being made is that we often think of conflict situations, but guns are also fired outside of conflict situations. And indeed, in the context of COVID-19, we have witnessed how the use of lethal weapon for purpose of enforcing COVID-19 regulations has led to days of people, in some circumstances, more death than the COVID-19 pandemic itself. So basically, the emphasis that is being put is that we shouldn't just focus on guns within the context of conflict, but we have also to look at the silencing of guns, even in situations that doesn't meet the threshold of conflict. Let me give the floor. I don't see Ambassador Tesfaye anymore. It looks like that Ambassador Tesfaye has, okay. I think Ambassador Tesfaye, if Ambassador Tesfaye is there, may we give the floor to Ambassador Tesfaye? Or
sorry.
Yes.
Sorry, Chairperson, he's not here. He has an urgent commitment. He went to the minister. Ambassador Tesfaye not here.
Okay, okay. Thank you so much. Ambassador Tesfaye has been called, so he had to leave us, unfortunately. So let me give the floor to Bruce. Bruce, you also mentioned the issue of arms in your intervention as well. So the points that have been made by the Vice Chair and also Commissioner Amsbury directly speak to that point as well.
Thanks, Chairperson, and thanks, commissioners, for that question. I will probably limit myself as ICRC representative to speak more on the humanitarian consequences of arms availability and what we see as the repercussions of the improper use or irresponsible use of arms. But maybe say that if you look at the consequences of the Hiroshima Nagasaki 75 years, we still continue to see the consequences of that, and there is still a lot of response that is being provided to people who are affected by this nuclear attack. We have silent killers still with us in a number of countries. Silent killers, basically anti-personnel mines and other weapons that were laid during conflicts, where today a number of land is not utilizable today because, of course, of the risk that is there of the anti-personnel mines and other silent weapons that are on the ground and continue to kill. You can also include the point of the irresponsible use of firearms by the security forces, and I think the example that is given, what we witnessed during COVID-19, is a demonstration of that. A number of African countries have ratified a number of these international instruments related to arms and weapons treaties, whether nuclear, whether small arms. Within the continent, we also have a number of small arms treaties and protocols. A number of countries have ratified that. But I think where the challenge lies is on the implementation. In other words, national efforts to ensure that the control of circulation and usage of arms within the continent is controlled. So it is important, I guess, also on the part of the work that we do as a national human rights organization, so to look into the actual situation in terms of arms availability usage, circulation within the country, and what efforts can we make in order to address that issue. The issue of purchases and transfers, I guess, I made an allusion to that, that for us, the experience we have seen, of course, is that yes, where arms are available in the country, there is a correlation in the end in terms of the impact of that availability of those arms and the quality of human rights standards when it comes to utilization of those arms by the security forces or by the fighting parties whenever they are using. So that is the comment I would like to make in terms of where I sit. I think it's important for us to continue to encourage countries to not only do the ratification of a number of treaties, but also to actually meet the obligations of that are incumbent in those treaties when it comes to stockpiles management, but also destruction of some of the stockpiles. If you remember, a few years ago, there was a huge explosion in Congo Brazzaville of an arms depot that caused a lot of death and destruction. So one cannot be surprised that we still have quite a number of stockpiles within the country of various weapons that I guess it's important also for the countries to pay particular attention to that as well when it comes to meeting the obligations of a number of treaties which they have signed that call upon the destruction of stockpiles of weapons that are still within the continent. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you so much, Bruce. I think in the interest of time, I wish just to us to conclude, given that we have run out of our time, as Vice Chair already indicated. The following, I think, important points come out from our deliberation. First, silencing the guns is a very noble objective whose realization is also a human rights imperative. That silencing the guns requires and necessitates respect for human and people's rights and also international humanitarian law. That this agenda of silencing the guns can be realized only through the concerted action of various role players, the Commission, the Peace and Security Council, and the ICRC, among others. Of course, we can't emphasize enough, as you rightly pointed out, Bruce, the role of national human rights commissions, civil society organizations, in the promotion of the culture of peace and also in advancing the cause for the resolution of conflicts. The other point is related to the purchase and use of weapons on the African continent. And indeed, here, one very important point that both the Vice Chair and Commissioner Amesbury made is basically one that can be directed to the African Union as it proceeds to have the extraordinary summit, is the point that one of the areas of intervention for achieving silencing the guns has to be the need for reducing the utilization of very scarce national resources and funds for purpose of buying weapons. And this has to go, of course, hand in hand, as you said, Bruce, with the need for effective control of both the circulation of weapons on the African continent, but also importantly, securing weapons depots, which is also a very critical point. That there is a need for a very serious intervention in looking into arms trade, particularly as it relates to the African continent, is an area that requires a very serious attention. And indeed, part of the commitment for silencing the guns, I think that is what members of the Commission are saying. Part of the commitment for silencing the guns has to be a commitment to reduce the budget for weapons and shift those budget for weapons to the fulfillment of other fundamental needs of society relating to socioeconomic rights, but also improving relations among members of society in order to avoid the need for resorting to violence and indeed conflict. Finally, I think there are many conditions and circumstances that precipitate and lead to the eruption of conflict and violence. And as our colleague who posted this note on the chat box highlighted, the issue of silencing the guns is not limited to conflict situations, that we have to work on silencing the guns in outside conflict situations as well, as the experience in COVID-19 has shown. And in this respect, of course, it is incumbent on me to draw the attention of all of you participants to Resolution 449 of the African Commission on Human and People's Rights, which we adopted during the 66th Ordinary Session, which specifically highlights this point of the need for silencing the guns outside, even outside conflict situations, insisting that the use of force, particularly lethal force, should be a last resort measure. It has to be thoroughly regulated, and it has to comply with the principles of necessity, proportionality, and legality. These are a prerequisite. These need to be complied with by all law enforcement institutions, by all security institutions. Finally, conditions of conflict come as a result of various contexts, various underlying factors, various drivers of conflict, which unfortunately for us in Africa are in abundance on our continent. But the existence of structural conditions and drivers of violence do not necessarily and should not necessarily lead to the eruption of conflict, armed conflict. It is the choices that actors in society make that ultimately leads to the eruption of armed conflicts. So the responsibility lies on those leaders, on those political actors across our societies who take decisions that actually brings societies into conflict. So it is the decision that they make to choose peace that also avoids a society from plunging itself into conflict. That is why the agency of our leaders, the agency of political actors, the agency of members of society, the agency of African Union institutions, the agency of all of us, the African Commission, and citizens is so critical if we are to achieve silencing the guns. Ultimately, whether we silence the guns or not depends on the decisions we make, the choices we take. Thank you all very much for your kind attention. This brings us to the end of this panel and indeed to the end of today's session. I would like to express my deep appreciation to our panelists, Ambassador Tesfaye Yilma, chairperson of the PSC in his absence, for joining us today, despite the difficulties that we have encountered due to technical glitches, for starting on time. And indeed, I wish to thank my dear brother, Bruce, for joining us and sharing your insights. Wish to thank Vice Chair and Commissioner Amsbury as well for your interventions, and colleagues on the chat platform for posting that very important observation. We will follow up on this agenda on the basis of the contributions of all of you towards highlighting these very important points that have been identified in the course of our panel for the broader African Union agenda on silencing the guns, particularly towards feeding into the extraordinary summit. Colleagues, excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, thank you. I wish you a very good evening. Would like to remind you that tomorrow we will be starting at 9 GMT. I very much appreciate your understanding as we dragged the session today beyond the time. My apologies for that personally. Thank you again. Have a good evening.